History is full of examples of sudden currency collapses. Argentina, Ukraine, Iceland, Venezuela, and Germany have all experienced terrible currency crises since 1900. The start of any collapse stems from a lack of faith in the stability of money to serve as an effective store of value or medium of exchange. As soon as we the people stop believing that a currency is useful, that currency enters a quick downfall. This can be brought on through a variety of ways, including low growth or inflation. Since the launch of quantitative easing, worried investors have asked, will the US dollar collapse? This interesting question has been brought to light once again due to the extreme measures taken by the United States Federal Reserve in recent months. To understand the possibility of a currency collapse, you have to understand a bit of history. Ever since the Bretton Woods agreements in 1944, other major governments and most importantly central banks have relied on the US dollar to back up their value of their own currency. This essentially made the US dollar the world's reserve currency, a status that brings with it countless benefits, including legitimacy in the eyes of domestic users, currency traders, and participants in international transactions. On top of this status, it helps that the American economy is still the largest and most important economy in the world, even though growth has slowed since 2001. The US still regularly beats out its peers in Europe and Japan. At the end of the day, these debt precedents are backed up by the productivity of American workers. But in recent times, these facts have begun to be challenged. Countless investors, including most famously Ray Dalio, signaled to troubling times ahead. Here he is talking about currency collapses.
Is there a real threat right now to the U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency?
Yes, there is a threat. It's an evolutionary type of process. There's not yet a good alternative in the form of a currency per se, but people are not investors, big, large institutional investors, don't run out necessarily to alternative currency because the three major reserve currencies all have the same basic problem. That's why they move into a new storehold of wealth. And you see that the storehold of wealth, like in 1933 reaction, is equities, is gold, is other asset classes that go up. So when you buy a company and you have low returns on your bonds and so on, that is that kind of movement, but the same is true for gold and other asset classes. If that gets too far, and it's standing the risk of, it's very dangerous. It looks like a currency defense. In other words, if those who are holding bonds, which are a lot, choose to sell the bonds because they're not providing a good return, and they're not, and because there's so much debt production and debt monetization, that puts the Federal Reserve or other central banks in the very difficult position of operating like a currency defense. Mechanistically, as money leaves that debt, that means either interest rates would rise, which would be terrible for the economy and markets, or they're forced to buy more and more. And that is how a spiral could occur.
What Dalio points out in that 90-second clip is incredibly important. While the status of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency can always be threatened and will eventually collapse, the current environment makes it unlikely, as all other world currencies face the same problems. The fundamental weakness of the US dollar is that it's only valuable through government fiat. This weakness is shared by every other major national currency in the world and is perceived as normal in the modern age. Things are no longer backed by gold. In fact, one of the reasons the IMF was formed was to monitor the Federal Reserve and its commitment to Bretton Woods. Today, the IMF uses other reserves as a discipline on Fed activity. While they have recently turned a blind eye to that, that was the original intent. If foreign governments or investors decide to switch away from the US dollar en masse, the flood of short positions could significantly hurt anyone with assets denominated in dollars. Fortunately for the United States, virtually every alternative currency is backed up by similar insane economic policies where money printing and debt monetization is prevalent. Even if the dollar faltered in absolute terms, it may still be stronger globally due to its strength relative to other alternatives. So will the US dollar collapse? Well, there are some conceivable scenarios that might cause a sudden crisis for the dollar. Like Dalio was saying, the most realistic is the dual threat of high inflation and high debt, a scenario in which rising consumer prices force the Fed to sharply raise interest rates. This would force the US into a recession, but even in that scenario, the pain will be felt throughout the world. The US economy is what other countries rely on for exports. Any economic collapse here will be felt in China, Japan, and Europe. All major exporters would face pain as we remain the largest economy in the world. At the end of the day, foreign exporters such as China and Japan do not want a dollar collapse because the United States is too important a customer. Even if the United States had to renegotiate or default on some debt obligations, there is little to no evidence that the world would let the dollar collapse and risk possible contagion. What is more likely is what Dalio stated there at the end. We would all be entering into a downward spiral of money printing, where eventually a huge worldwide economic disaster could force central banks into different types of assets like gold and equities. In a way, the central banks would position themselves to become currency defenders. If you're interested in protecting yourself against this scenario, listen to Dalio's speeches on how he invests for the future. Thank you guys for watching. Please make sure you hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed, and leave a comment if you think the US dollar will collapse and why.